Are we rolling, Bob?
Yep.
The prince was thus, in its immediate object, a bid for employment by the Medici. It was a final appeal, all else having failed, through the medium of his ideas, and it was for his ideas above all that he craved employment. Italy, slowly sinking under the domination of the foreigner, was facing servitude, and the Medici were in a strategic position to determine its future. Controlling both Florence and the papacy, they held a nucleus of power which might easily control the peninsula if they extended their dominions, and this was known to be the cherished ambition of Leo. His object, Vittori wrote in one of his moments of lucidity, is to maintain the church in the prestige in which he has found it, and not to diminish its states unless he does so for the benefit of his family, that is, his brother Giuliano or his nephew Lorenzo, on whom he is thinking in any event of conferring states. That he intends to confer states on his family is plain. All our past popes, Calixtus, Pius, Sixtus, Innocent, Alexander, and Julius, have done so. Those that did not, could not. Furthermore, his family is concerning itself little with Florence, a sure sign that they are thinking of other established states where they will not have to humor their subjects continually. What states he has in mind I shall not discuss, as he will change his mind with occasion. Here then was a lever to move Italy. The paramount need of the hour was national union, a forlorn hope. As for the union of the Italians, Machiavelli wrote in despair, "You make me laugh. There has never been union among them for any good purpose." The one collective principle which that race of obstinate individualists recognized was the family. It was only out of the family that patriotism could grow. It had been the cardinal error of Julius to undervalue that principle, but his error was the opportunity of the Medici. In pursuing their family ambitions, they might become national leaders on two conditions. First, that they identify their interests with those of Italy, and second, that they acquire and maintain their new states successfully. To those two objects, the prince was dedicated. The first inspired the glowing exordium, "This opportunity must not be missed to reveal to Italy after so many years her liberator." Nor can I say with what love he would be welcomed in all those provinces which have suffered from these foreign floods, with what thirst for revenge, what stubborn faith, what devotion, what tears, what gates would be closed to him, what people would refuse him allegiance, what treachery would resist him, what Italian would deny him homage. For this barbarian domination stinks in all our nostrils. Be this, therefore, the mission of your illustrious house. Assume it with the courage and hope of a just enterprise, so that under its banner our fatherland may be ennobled, and under its auspices the words of Petrarch may be verified. Virtue over against rage will run to arms, and brief be the shock, for yet the antique courage is not dead in the Italian stock. The second object inspired the book itself, with its systematic analysis of the principles by which new states are secured and retained. But beside the personal and patriotic inspirations of the prince, there was a third which combined them both. The Medici had a forerunner in their messianic mission, a man who had given Italy a gleam of hope that he had been sent to redeem it, but he was rejected by fortune, so that it still waits for one to come to heal its wounds. Such was the singular transformation which Cesare Borgia had undergone in his mind. In retrospect, Machiavelli saw him prophetically. Like the Medici, he had been on the point of forming a strong state which might eventually have become the focus for national union. And though that state had been reared for his own aggrandizement, it had reverted after his death to the church. On that basis, Julius had built for the expulsion of the barbarian, and it was now for Leo to achieve what Valentino had begun. In that pyramidal design, Machiavelli saw the synthesis of the past, and he surveyed the future with confident lucidity. The success of the Medici reconciled him to the failure of Valentino, and it was his method which he proposed to them as an example. The prince is Cesare Borgia, resurrected in a glorious avatar to redeem Italy by his virtù. But his method was useless without his spirit. And if his spirit was that of Antichrist, such was the gospel of patriotism. Christianity was possible only in private life. It was inconsistent with patriotism, since it leads us to depreciate the love of the world and makes us mild. The ancients, on the contrary, made the love of this world the supreme good and were more fierce in their actions and sacrifices. The ancient religion beatified only men of mundane glory, such as generals of armies and founders of republics. Ours glorifies meek and contemplative rather than active men. For us, the supreme good lies in humility and submission and in the contempt of the world, whereas for them it lay in greatness of spirit and strength of limb and in everything that makes men bold. Ours teaches men to be strong and enduring rather than in doing, and thus the world has become the prey of scoundrels who have found men willing, in order to gain heaven, to endure injuries rather than to avenge them. The virtues of Christ could only survive under the protection of Antichrist. Antithetical, they were complementary. Each had his own sphere. The error lay in confusing them, the common error of judging a public man by his private character. Even he had slipped into it, and in a moment of sentimental weakness had heaped moral obloquy on his fallen idol. But after the failure of Soderini, he reverted to Cesare, and the prince was an apology, a monument of reparation and apotheosis to the memory of a man whom he had wronged. Over against the virtues of Christ, the stamina of Caesar, the classic virtue which made the liberation of Italy the mission of Antichrist, and Machiavelli invoked and extolled it with the mortified longing of the defeated. The first requisite, therefore, was to inculcate into the new prince a robust public conscience. His education was ethical as well as political. I do not see how one can censure him, he concluded a recapitulation of Cesare's career. On the contrary, it seems to me that I should offer him as a model to all who by fortune or the support of others rise to power. For being great in spirit and lofty in ambition, he could not have governed himself otherwise than he did. Therefore, he who must secure himself a new principality, win friends, overcome by force or by fraud, make himself loved and feared by his people and revered and obeyed by his soldiers, exterminate those who have power or reason to harm him, change the old order for the new, be severe and gentle, magnanimous and liberal, destroy a disloyal soldiery and create a new one, and maintain friendships with sovereigns in such a manner that they must help him with zeal and offend him with caution, cannot find a more living example than the actions of this man. The blood which that career cost was not wasted. Machiavelli pauses to make a point, citing the example of a tyrant of Syracuse who built his career on wanton brutality. Yet it cannot be called talent to slay fellow citizens, to deceive friends, to be without friends, without faith, without mercy, without religion. Such methods may gain empire but not glory. The difference was obvious. Harshness, properly used, if of evil it is lawful to speak well, is that which is necessary to one's security, and which is applied at one blow and not persisted in afterwards. Harshness, improperly used, is that which, though small to begin with, multiplies rather than decreases with time. Injuries should be done all at once, so that, being felt less, they offend less. Benefits should be given little by little, so that the flavor of them may last longer. Nevertheless, the virtues of a prince must be martial ones. A prince should have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. This is the sole art that belongs to the ruler, and it is of such value that it not only supports those who are born princes, but often enables men to rise to the rank to that rank from a private station, and contrariwise, we see that when princes have thought more of ease than of arms, they have lost their states. The only exceptions are the rulers of ecclesiastical states, for they are sustained by the ancient ordinances of religion, which are so all-powerful and of such a nature that the principalities may be held no matter how their princes behave and live. Such principalities are secure and happy, and they prove nothing. Prince being a militarist, the question arises of the type of military he should employ, and Machiavelli returns to his obsession. As the Medici had abolished the militia, it was necessary to remind them that in mercenaries, cowardice is the danger, in auxiliaries, valor, and the wise prince has always avoided these arms and turned to his own, choosing rather to lose with them than to conquer with others, for a victory won by the arms of others is never a real one. And he pointed to the principle, despite the disastrous experience of Prato, with a proof that was always conclusive. I shall never hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia and his actions. The difference between one arm and the other can easily be seen by comparing the prestige of the Duke. First, when he employed the French. Second, when he employed the Vitelli and the Orsini. Third, when he relied on his own soldiers, on whose fidelity he could always count, and which was constantly growing. He was never more highly esteemed than when he was, and was seen by everyone to be completely master of his own forces. The prince being now, by the methods of Cesare Borgia, in possession of his state, it remains to be seen what should be his rules of conduct toward his subjects and friends. And as I know that many have written on this point, I suppose I shall be considered presumptuous in raising it again, especially as I shall depart from the methods of other people. But if what I write is to be of use to those who understand it, it seems to me more profitable to pursue facts than fancy. Many have portrayed principalities and republics which have never been known in reality. But the difference between how we live and how we should live is so great that to neglect what is for what should be is more likely to ruin than to save us. The man who would act entirely in obedience to virtue can only be ruined among so many who are evil. To hold his own, the prince must learn, therefore, how to be unrighteous and to use evil or not, according to necessity. From this principle of expediency, the whole moral code of the prince derives. The first accepted virtue to be revalued is liberality, a quality of peculiar importance at a period when wealth was prized primarily for its moral revenue, for show, for patronage, for reputation, rather than for material satisfaction. And for the prince, therefore, the essential is to be reputed liberal. Liberality exercised in a manner that does not bring you to the reputation of it injures you. If you exercise it honestly, as it should be exercised, it may not become known, and you will be censured for the want of it. Therefore, a prince should not shrink from the reputation of meanness. He will in reality be exercising liberality toward all those from whom he does not take, who are numberless, and meanness only toward those to whom he does not give, who are few. And for the benefit of the lavish Medici, nothing wastes so rapidly as liberality. For even while you exercise it, you lose the power to do so and become either poor and despised, or in avoiding poverty, rapacious and hated. Above all things, a prince should guard against being despised and hated. And liberality leads you to both. The next problem is the use of clemency and cruelty. Every prince should desire to be considered clement and not cruel, but he should be careful not to misuse mercy. And Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Nevertheless, his ruthlessness reconciled Romagna, unified it, and restored it to peace and loyalty. He was more compassionate than the Florentines, who, to avoid the imputation of cruelty, allowed Pistoia to be destroyed by the factions. And of all princes, It is impossible for the new prince to avoid the charge of cruelty, since new states are full of dangers. Upon this, a question arises, whether it is better to be loved or feared. In general, this is true of men. They are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours body and soul. They will offer you their blood, property, life, children while the need is distant, but when it approaches, they turn against you, and they have less scruple in injuring a man who is beloved than one who is feared. For love rests on the bonds of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, are broken with every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by an unfailing security, the apprehension of punishment. Nevertheless, a prince should inspire fear in such a way that, though he does not win love, he avoids hatred, which is always possible provided he does not touch the property of his subjects and their women. Above all, he must keep his hands off their property, for men forget the death of a father more readily than the loss of their patrimony. Among the many wonderful deeds of Hannibal, this one is recorded, that having led an enormous army composed of many races to fight in foreign lands, no dissensions arose either among them or against the prince, whether in his good or bad fortune. This was due to nothing else but his inhuman cruelty. Without that cruelty, his other virtues were insufficient for his purpose. Short-sighted writers admire his deeds from one point of view, and from another condemn the principal cause of them. I conclude, therefore, that as men love according to their free will and fear at the will of the prince, a wise prince should build on that which he and not another controls, seeking merely, as I have said, not to be hated. The emancipation of the prince from the bonds of private morality is now carried one step further, in a yet more radical innovation. Everyone admits how laudable it is how laudable it is in a prince to keep faith and to live with integrity and not with craft. Nevertheless, the experience of our times has shown us that those princes who have accomplished great things have set little store by good faith, that they have circumvented the minds of men by craft, and that in the end they have overcome those who have based their conduct on good faith. There are two ways of combating, by law or by force. The first is proper to man, the second to brutes, and as the first does not suffice, we are compelled to resort to the second. The prince, therefore, must know how to use the brute and the man, which is what the ancients signified by the fable of Achilles reared by the centaur. And among the brutes, the prince should adopt the lion and the fox, for the lion cannot defend himself against snares, nor the fox against wolves. To rely on the lion alone is to know nothing. Therefore, a wise prince cannot nor should not keep faith to his disadvantage when the reasons which caused him to pledge it no longer exist. If men were entirely good, this precept would not hold, but since they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you are not bound to observe it with them. But it is necessary to know how to color such conduct and to be a great dissembler, and men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that they are easily deceived. One recent example I cannot pass over in silence. Alexander VI never did anything else but deceive, nor ever thought of anything but deceiving, and always found dupes. And yet he succeeded, for he knew this side of the world. And now, to seal and secure these qualities of calculation, economy, cruelty, and cunning, one thing more is needed: a shining coat of hypocrisy. Though a prince need not possess all the good qualities I have mentioned,
Chris, is that you?
to seem to have them is useful. As, for example, to seem merciful, loyal, humane, religious, and sincere. And to be so. But to be so with a mind so flexible that if the need arise, he can change to the contrary. He should be careful to let nothing fall from his lips that is not instinct with the 5 qualities I have mentioned, and must appear to those who see and hear him all compassion, all faith, all humanity, all religion, all integrity. Nothing is more necessary than to seem to have these last qualities, because in general, men judge by the eye rather than by the touch, For it is given to everyone to see, and to few to touch him. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few know what you are, and those few dare not oppose the opinion of the many who are protected by the prestige of the state. Let the prince consider the conquest and security of his state. The means will always be found honorable, and everyone will commend them, because the vulgar always judge by appearances and by results. And in the world there are only the vulgar, for the few find a place there only when the many have no ground to rest on. But Machiavelli was in a mood too austere to indulge in baiting the vulgar. He owed the common conscience of mankind an explanation of his code which contradicted all its accepted opinions, and he proceeded to vindicate it. A beacon for the future. His prince was a rebuke to the past, to the improvident princes who had betrayed Italy to the barbarian by their political sins, their shiftlessness, temporizing, and sloth, their common disunion and individual helplessness, their abject dependence and blind speculation on the only providence they knew, the mutable divinity of fortune. And suddenly the theme deepens, the discussion broadens, the subject is thrown up against the illimitable vista of man buffeted by his fate. And its basic impulse rises in an effort to rally and pit the will, the courage, the intelligence of man against the overbearing power that builds and unbuilds his being. It is not unknown to me that many men have believed and still believe that the affairs of this world are so governed by fortune and God that the wisdom of man is powerless to direct or stay them, and that it is useless therefore to give them too much thought, and that we should let chance rule them. This belief has gained credit in our time because of the great changes we have seen and still see every day beyond all human conjecture. In thinking of this, I am sometimes tempted partly to agree with this opinion. Yet, not to forfeit our free will, I hold that fortune may be the arbiter of half of our affairs, but that she lets us govern the other, or maybe a little less. I liken her to one of those ravaging torrents which, when they rage, flood the plains, ruin trees and houses, and carry the soil here and there. Everyone flees, everyone yields to the onrush, unable to resist. But it does not follow that when the weather clears, men should not make provision with defenses and barriers against the return of the flood by drawing it off in channels, so that its force may be neither so unchecked nor so dangerous. So it is with fortune, who shows her power where virtue is not prepared to resist her, and vents her fury where she knows neither bulwarks nor barriers have been raised to contain her. This is the sanction of that code of unscrupulous efficiency, is a creed of self-preservation. Buffeted by fortune, overborne by blind chance, man controls a fraction of his destiny, half, maybe less, only by the constant exercise of courage, will, and intelligence, and even these do not suffice. Into his positive gospel there now creeps a mystic element which Machiavelli is forced to admit. The prince must develop a flair for the time spirit. He who acts in accordance with the spirit of the times, I believe, will succeed. But with his usual repugnance to mysticism, Machiavelli frankly prefers self-confidence. For my part, I think it better to be bold and calculating, because fortune is a female, and to down her we must beat and bully her. And we see that she yields more often to the bold than to those who go to her coldly. And so, womanlike, she is always a lover of young men because they are less cautious and more violent, and with more audacity command her. It is the time spirit, however, that inspires the synthesis and coda of his gospel. Considering, therefore, all the matters of which we have treated, and reflecting whether the present time in Italy will be favorable for a new prince, if there would be an opportunity for a prudent and able one to introduce new forms which would bring him honor and to all men advantage, so many things seemed to me to conspire in his favor that I never knew a time more fit than the present. If it was needful that the people of Israel should be captive to manifest the virtue of Moses, that the Persians should be oppressed by the Medes to discover the magnanimity of Cyrus, and that the Athenians should be scattered to illustrate the ability of Theseus, then at the present time to discover the virtue of an Italian spirit it was necessary that Italy should be reduced to the extremity in which she now is, more enslaved than the Hebrews, more oppressed than the Persians, more scattered than the Athenians, without head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, overrun, and enduring every kind of desolation. We see her imploring God to deliver her from the cruelty and insolence of the barbarian. We see her ready and disposed to follow a banner if only someone will raise it. And we see no one at present in whom we can hope, if not in your illustrious house, which with its virtue and fortune, favored by God and the Church, of which it is now the ruler, can lead this redemption. This will not be difficult if you recall the lives and actions of the men I have mentioned. Though they were great and remarkable men, yet they were men, and none of them had more opportunity than the present affords. Their enterprises were no easier, or no more just, nor was God more their friend than he is yours. Justice is on our side, a necessary war is a just war, and arms are hallowed when there is no hope save in arms. Moreover, how remarkably and beyond all example have the ways of God been manifested. The sea is divided, the cloud is led the way, the rock has poured forth water, it has rained manna, everything has contributed to your elevation, you should do the rest. God is not willing to do everything and deprive us of our free will and that share of glory which is rightly ours. And with that mounting and mosaic exhortation, in a final rally, Machiavelli joins the prophets. He had published his substance, he had climbed Sinai, and from San Casciano he surveyed Florence and revealed his whole vision and his full stature as an armed prophet. Across the years he challenged at last, in a supreme counterblast to Christianity, the spirit of Savonarola, and the second great lawgiver of the Renaissance confronted the first. Inspired by the time spirit, he even assumed the tone, the mystic exaltation and imagery of his predecessor. But though his creed was the antithesis of that of his forerunner, something visionary seemed to mislead him too. The very realism of the prince defeats its own purpose. The Redeemer of the chosen people is the outcome of their defeat. His one goal is success, his one virtue efficiency, his only principle expediency. His morality is the martial law of the soul, in which the normal rights of humanity are suspended. But as politics are a perpetual emergency, either latent or actual, expediency becomes his normal law. He is emancipated from common prejudices. He exists in a moral void. His conduct is to be adjudged by the mind alone. He is a scientific creation. That is his strength, and it is also his weakness. In the political philosophy of the prince, there is no mention of his social responsibility. His functions begin and end with war. He is an isolated figure in a hostile world, with which his relations are defensive and offensive. He is one more manifestation of Italian individualism, the self-made man raised to political power for the satisfaction of his own ambition, and his subjects benefit at best indirectly by his success. It is logical that, with this premise, his principles should be antisocial. But it is also logical that in the long run, the systematic practice of cunning, cruelty, and hypocrisy should undermine the confidence upon which the social compact and the stability of the state depend, and perpetuate the abnormal and unsettled conditions of which he is the outcome. This unresolved inconsistency is a radical defect which makes the realism of the system specious and short-sighted. And Machiavelli himself seems to suspect it by the insistence with which he qualifies principles which, fully developed, could only lead to the ruin of his prince. But compromise is only begging the question, for a like inconsistency underlies the basic assumption on which the book is built, that public morality is one thing and private another. The distinction is artificial. How is it possible for the prince to separate his private and public conduct in hermetic cells, to change his nature with his functions, or that in the constant interaction of ruler and ruled one should not affect and demoralize the other? To isolate political phenomena and study them scientifically in a moral void is, after all, a fallacy which gives a taint of academicism to the prince. In the end, the choice between personal and political morality, between Christ and Antichrist, could only be made for life as a whole, and in making it, Machiavelli was the victim of his own defeat. Men who practice unscrupulousness do not write books in praise of it. Machiavelli preached what he deplored and professed what he could not practice, but only at the cost of a profound self-division. He recognized reality and subdued his own conscience to it. It was an act of discipline, but also of insincerity toward himself. He surrendered to nature, and his gospel, while it seemed scientifically sound, was morally vulgar. But was it even scientifically sound? For the salvation of Italy, he prescribed a code of cultured savagery, which was too primitive to be successfully practiced by a race which, for better or worse, had outgrown barbarism, and which could only ruin its civilization. The prince, in fact, like all such manuals of cultured perversity and anachronistic sternness, was the product of a high civilization in decadence, and its creed, sprung from defeat, could only beget defeat. In the last analysis, Machiavelli had proved the opposite of what he set out to demonstrate. If his gospel proved anything, it was that moral expediency was a contradiction in terms, that the moral law was absolute or nothing, that moral values were intrinsic and could not be subordinated to self-interest without sapping and destroying them. Unwittingly, he confirmed Savonarola. They had much in common. Both started from the same disabused view of life, the same radical recognition of its brutality, and both developed their faiths to an extreme and uncompromising conclusion. Like all spiritual rebels, Machiavelli was akin to what he repudiated and confirmed it by his apostasy. He too, like his forerunner, was a victim of his temperament and the time spirit. Religious faith was decaying, undermined by the corruption of the clergy, classic culture, material ease, and the fanatical failure of the friar. But the need of faith was undying, and the substitute which Machiavelli offered was the choice of his own temperament, the religion of the state. His gospel was merely the logical creed, developed to its extreme limits, of the sacred egoism and arid virtue of patriotism. The Prince is a melancholy book. To be enrolled among the prophets, it only remained for Machiavelli to be unrecognized by his own countrymen. But if ever a creed was destined for recognition, it was his, for it merely codified, in effect, the common practice of mankind. The only handicap was that it was too candid. And that was perhaps a real difficulty, as he had dedicated it to the gentlest of the Medici, Giuliano. But Giuliano was the representative of the Pope in Florence. As a test, Machiavelli decided to submit his book to the searching eyes and level judgment of his intellectual equal, Vettori, and it was a mutual friend, Filippo Casavecchia, who carried the theme to Rome, where he was to spend the winter with Vettori. And then the difficulties began. With the arrival of Casavecchia, who was not a little censorious, the ambassador found himself under criticism for the life he led, and to make matters worse, his steward, Brancaccio, also objected to it. For the moment, Vettori was too involved to think of anything else. If I have not replied before to your letter of the 10th, and perhaps will not reply as I should today, the reason, he explained, is that Brancaccio and Casavecchia annoy me every day, reminding me of the dignity of the city and the duties of my office. You know that I find some pleasure in women, though rather to chat with them than for any other satisfaction, for I am now of an age when I can do little else but talk. But Filippo, as you know, is averse to their company. Before he came, as my lodging is somewhat unusual, courtesans would often visit me to see the church and the garden adjoining the house, and it never occurred to me when Filippo arrived to send and warn them not to be so bold as to show themselves here. So that the day before yesterday, one entered the room just at dinner time and was freely admitted by the servants as usual. She sat down and made herself at home, so that I could neither dismiss her nor explain her presence to Filippo, who opened a pair of round and disdainful eyes at the sight of her. We sat down to table, dined and talked, and after dinner she went as usual to walk in the garden. I remained with Filippo, who opened a pair of who began his Philippic somewhat as follows. I trust, Your Honor, you will not take it amiss if I, who from our childhood together, foreseeing a long lecture and scenting its drift, I interrupted him and said that I understood from the beginning what was to follow and wished neither to listen to correction nor to justify myself, for I had always lived a free man and meant to do so for the rest of my days. Whereupon, though reluctantly, he consented that women might come to my house as they pleased. With Brancaccio, Vettori's difficulties were of another order. Brancaccio disapproved of the visits of a certain Sersano, a Roman broker of unsavory repute, whom Vettori received only on business, his predecessor having undertaken a suit for him. The ambassador was nettled. Between these two censors, you see my position, he went on, and how I must account for whatever I say and whomever I receive. I wish you would tell me whether you think Filippo or Brancaccio has the more right to scold me. I'm fond of them both, but for all their reproofs and reminders, I shall continue to do as I please. Then he bethought himself of the prince. You write me, and Filippo has told me that you have composed a book on statecraft. If you will send it to me, I shall be pleased, and though I am not an expert, I think I should judge your work. What my judgment and competence lack, my affection and faith will supply. And when I have read it, I will give you my opinion whether or not you should present it to the Magnifico Giuliano. But what he really wanted at this moment was not the book, but its author. Your objection to coming here seems to me easy to dispel. Nothing will happen to you if you pay a single visit to Cardinal Soderini. Piero Soderini is in a settled mood, and I do not think he would care to be visited. Perhaps particularly by you. And if you avoid him, I do not think it will be imputed to ingratitude, for I've been thinking it over, and I do not find that he or his family have done you any unusual favors. You did not owe your position to them. You had been employed for 3 years before he became Gonfalonier, and in whatever capacity he used you, you served him faithfully and received merely the usual compensation. We've been trying to find something for you here in Rome. There has been some talk of Cardinal de Medici, that is Giulio de Medici, the Pope's cousin, being made legate to France, and I have thought of speaking to him since you have been there and have some experience of that court and knowledge of French ways. If we succeed, so much the better. If we fail, we've lost nothing. While Vettori was thinking of speaking to the Medici, Machiavelli, however, was thinking of his friend's plight, and his reply, overflowing with gaiety, brought Vettori back to his own business. I must say, it is marvelous, wrote that expert friend, to see how blind men are to their own sins, and how bitterly they persecute the vices they lack. I could cite you examples in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Chaldee, and press on into the land of Prester John and Sophie to prove it, if there were not so many homegrown and recent examples. I am sure Sersano could have come to your house from one jubilee to another, and Filippo would not have minded. I am sure, on the other hand, that if the whole bordello of Valenza had the run of your house, Brancaccio would not have batted an eye. Nay, he would have lauded you more highly than if he heard you haranguing the Pope more eloquently than Demosthenes. And if you wished to prove it, you needed merely to pretend, without letting one know the complaint of the other, to believe them both, and to obey their precepts, shut your door to the hussies in Sersano, looked solemn, and pondered your ways, and I guarantee that not 4 days would have passed before Filippo would have been saying, what's become of Sersano? Why does he never come to see us? It's too bad, such a decent man. I cannot understand what people have against him. He knows all the ins and outs of the court. He's a useful busybody. You should send for him, Your Honor. As for Brancaccio, I need not tell you how pained and surprised he would be by the absence of women. If he did not bring up the subject like Filippo, as he warmed his backside by the fire, he would have told you in private. And the better to convince you, I should have dropped in while you were reforming and exclaimed, Your Honor, you will fall sick. You take no recreation, there are no boys here, no women. What is this house, an infirmary? My dear ambassador, this world is full of fools, and few know that to follow the advice of others leads us nowhere, for no two men are ever of one mind. Nor do they know that a man who passes for wise by day will never be accounted a fool by night. If he is considered respectable and trustworthy, whatever he may do to gladden his heart will do him honor and no shame, and instead of being blamed as a humbug and a wencher, he will be called a good fellow. And something else they do not know, that what he gives is his own, and he takes nothing from others. He is like wine when it ferments. It lends its aroma to the vessels that smell of must, and takes no mold from the vessels. Therefore, my dear ambassador, forget the mold of Sersano and the tongue of gossip, and follow your ways, and let Brancaccio talk, for he does not realize that he is like one of those wee wrens, that is the first to scold and squawk, and when the owl comes, the first to be caught. And our friend Filippo is like a buzzard, which, when there is no carrion in the country, flies 100 leagues to find one, and when he's gorged, perches on a pine and scolds at the eagles, falcon, and other such fowl as, being dainty of their food, go hungry half the year round. So, your honor, let the one gorge and the other squawk, and mind you your own business. With this letter, Machiavelli had precipitated an unforeseen and far-reaching imbroglio. Vettori, hungry for approval, promptly acted on his advice, dismissed the women in Sersano, and reported to his dearest crony, I have always praised your genius and approved your judgment in little things as in great. And the advice you gave me in your last about Filippo and Brancaccio bore fruit in a few days. As you know, I have more faith in others than in myself, and am always anxious to please everyone but myself. I yielded, therefore, to their persuasions, and agreed to believe them. We lived in this way for about 8 days, and no one came to the house except a few people on business and a certain Donato Bossi, who is a grammarian by profession, a man with a strange, austere face. And he never speaks of anything but the root of a word and the derivation of a name, and whether the verb should come at the beginning or the end of a clause, and similar matters of no moment, and which are very tedious to hear. And I did nothing but ply him with questions on his hobby and to draw him out. And though such a life vexed me, I bore it as best I could to convince Filippo and Brancaccio of their error. Nor did I have to wait long. For one evening, as we were seated by the fire, Brancaccio began by saying that I should invite a certain lady, who is one of my neighbors, and that not to invite her was unsociable, a quality which many people take amiss, and that men who are so reserved are considered peculiar, ill-bred. But first I must tell you what the condition of this lady is, so that you may understand why both urged me to invite her. As I wrote you before, my lodging, though close to the palace, is a little out of the way, in a street that is not much frequented, and among neighbors of a lowly class. But next door, in a very decent house, there lives a Roman widow of good family, who has been, and still is, pleasant company. And though she is past her prime, she has a daughter of about 20, who's exceedingly pretty, and who does a little trade on the side. She is also a son of about 14, well-bred and gentle, but of good morals and decent, as a boy should be at that age. And as our houses are next door and our gardens adjoin, I could not avoid some acquaintance with this lady, though I made it a distant one, and she has often come to ask me for favors with the Pope and the Governor, and I've helped her whenever I could, as we're bound to do with widows and minors. This then was the widow whom Brancaccio persuaded me to invite to supper, and Filippo, with his eye on the boy, added his pleas, so that I finally told them that I consented to do whatever they wished. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening when we reached this decision, and I did not suppose that they would call in my neighbors at that hour, so when they left me, I sat down to write a letter to the 10. And I was reflecting on how to compose it so as not to disclose all the plans of His Holiness, because I did not know if it would please him, and yet not to write so barrenly that they should think that they, the 10, should think me lacking in diligence or ability, or that I did not show them the proper respect, being as they are the first men in the city. And while I was in this quandary, in came the widow with her son and daughter and a brother, who came as a chaperone. I rose and received her as agreeably as possible, given my nature. You may have noticed that flattering phrases and effusive welcomes are not my habit. But I made an effort and finished the letter abruptly, saying that I could form no opinion until I knew the decision of the Swiss at the Diet of the Epiphany. Meanwhile, Brancaccio sat down to chat with the daughter and Filippo with the boy, and to give them more liberty, I called the widow and her brother aside and inquired about a lawsuit of theirs so as to occupy them and give time to the others until we sat down to supper. but I could not help listening from time to time to what Brancaccio was saying to Costantia, such is her name, and you never heard such blandishments. He praised her breeding, her beauty, her conversation, everything that can be praised in a woman. Filippo was as glib with the boy, asking if he studied, if he had a master, and, as he warmed to the subject, if he slept with him. So that the lad often hung his head in confusion without replying. By then it was supper time, and we sat down gaily. Afterwards we gathered about the fire and spent the time telling stories and playing games. And you would have laughed when, shortly before supper, Piero del Bene came in, interrupting their sport but not mine. I should have preferred not to have him enter, but I do not know how to offend, or to feign, so in he came, but he had so cold a welcome from Filippo and Brancaccio that he soon withdrew. We spent the evening pleasantly, and about midnight the neighbors retired and we went to bed. But Niccolo mio, now I must complain of you. For in pleasing my friends, I have been captivated myself by this Constantia. Previously, when women came here, I never lost my heart. I really whiled away time with them. Now this girl comes, and I venture to say that you never laid eyes on a lovelier, a more fetching creature. I had seen her before, to be sure, but only from a distance, and on closer acquaintance she delights me so much that I can think of nothing else. And since I have sometimes seen you in love and known what you suffered, I am resisting as well as I can at the start. I do not know whether my efforts will suffice, and I doubt it, but whatever the outcome, I shall write you. I've seen the chapters of your book, and they please me beyond measure. And until I have the remainder, I do not wish to give a final opinion. Filippo does not like what you say about his battening on carrion. He says that he always covets perfection, and that it is you who take everything that comes without discrimination. How, at such a moment, could Vittori form an opinion of the prince? Agitated, distracted, confused, he skimmed a few chapters, was impressed beyond measure, and shelving the bomb, returned to more important matters. And Machiavelli approved. He thoroughly appreciated their importance. In fact, when I think over this story from beginning to end, truly, if I had not lost touch with everything, I would insert it among my memories of modern life, for it seems to me worthy of being told to a prince as something which I have learned this very year. He entered into the drama with ardor, for he had created it, and recreated the scene as he pictured it in San Casciano. I seem to see Brancaccio squatting on a footstool, better to contemplate the fair face of Costantia. And with words and gestures, and laughing and attitudes, and with ecstatic mouthings and eyings and spitting, gruel and pine, and hang on the words, breath, looks, odor, and soft ways, and womanly charm of Costantia. Next, turning to my right hand, I behold the boy, and Casa, yet nearer his goal, and grazing his cheek with a bald-headed old. I see him gesticulate and shift from one side to the other. I see him shake his head sometimes at the bashful replies of the boy. I see him talking now as a father, now as a tutor, now as a lover, and the poor lad wondering, where's he leading him? At one moment fearing for his honor, at another trusting to his gravity, at another impressed by the fine, mature appearance of the man. I see you, my dear ambassador, coping with the widow and her brother, but keeping an eye on the boy, the right one and the left on the girl, and one ear for the widow and one for Casa and Brancaccio. I hear you reply vaguely and like echo to the last words, and at last break off the conversation with those little, long, quick strides of yours, a trifle stiff in the hams. I see Filippo, Brancaccio, the boy, the girl, rise as you approach, and I hear you say, sit down, do not rise, go on talking. and after many formalities, a little fulsome and homebred no doubt, they all sit down again and begin some delightful conversation. And above all, I seem to see Filippo when Piero del Bene came in. If I could paint, I would send you his portrait. For certain of his familiar attitude, certain sidelong glances, certain supercilious poses cannot be described. I see you at table, flourishing the bread and the glasses, and the trestles quivering, and everyone brimming, nay, running over with joy. And at last, deluging everything in a flood of mirth. And lastly, I see Jove yoked to the chariot. I see you in the toils of love. And because green wood burns best, your flame is the hotter for the resistance it meets. Here I may be permitted to exclaim with Terence, O coelum, O terram, O Maria Neptuni, O heaven, O earth, O Neptune's seas. I see you at war with yourself, et quia non bene conveniunt, nec una in sede morantur majestas et amor. For dignity and love do ill agree or share one throne. Fain would you be a swan, to leave an egg in her lap. Fain turn to gold, to lie for aye in her pocket. Fain be any animal, so you might never leave her. And since my example alarms you, and you recall what the shafts of love have done to me, I am bound to report how I dealt with the blind boy. The truth is, I let him have his way, and found more mercy than if I had denied him. Off then with the bit, off with the reins, close your eyes and say, lead on, love, be thou my guide. Thine be the honor if I win, thine the shame if I lose, thou art the master. This is what I have to say in reply to your letter. Then for a moment he glanced at his own life. Here, there's nothing to report. When I go to Florence, I spend my time between the shop of Donato del Corno and the house of La Riccia, and I seem to bore them both. One calls me a shop pest and the other a house pest. Still, I make myself useful to both as a confidential advisor, and this reputation has served me so well that Donato lets me have a warm seat by his fire, and the Riccia sometimes lets me steal a kiss on the sly. Their favor, I think, will not last long, for I have given each some advice, and neither apparently the right counsel. Only today Riccia said, pretending to address her servant, These wiseacres, I do not know where they belong. They seem to tell you the contrary of everything. You see, Your Honor, where the devil I belong. And he concluded, I should like to keep their favor. For me there is no cure. If any should occur to you, or to Filippo or Brancaccio, I should be grateful if you would write me. But this muffled appeal fell on deaf ears. The comedy he had started in Rome had entered a new phase. It was turning serious. Vettore complained of his conscience. For himself, too, he saw no cure. Little he cared for his dignity. I think I had more dignity when I am Francesco in Florence than his honor in Rome, he replied. But I have been reminding myself that I am 40 years old, that I have a wife, that I have married and unmarried daughters, that I have no money to squander, that it's only fair that I should save all I can spare for my daughters, that it's cowardly to succumb to the flesh, that she's my neighbor, that I would be spending money on her every day and would be gaining in return only endless trouble. Besides, as she is young and lively and pretty, I tell myself that she's bound to attract others of a very different sort than myself as she attracts me, so that I should have little pleasure and would be in continual jealousy. And turning these thoughts over, I resolved to put her out of my mind. And in this infatuation I remained for 2 days, and already felt so firm that nothing could shake my resolve. But he reckoned without the Roman widow, who had everything of a lady but the income. On the 3rd day, it so happened, the mother came to see me in the evening and brought her daughter along with her, and I, who had sworn to defend myself like a man in armor, was captivated by her words and gestures. The mother talked of her affairs and then left the room, leaving her alone with me by the fire, and I could not refrain from speaking to her, and touching her hand and her throat, and she seemed so lovely and charming that I forgot all my resolutions, and I decided to yield and be her prey, and to be guided and governed as she pleased. What followed, I will not tell you, suffice it to say that I have known more jealousy and vexation than I expected. So far the expense has been slight, but my mind has been in continual anxiety. The more I speak to her, the more I wish to speak to her, the more I see her, the more I long to see her. It might be of some help if my nephew Piero came to the house. Once he came to supper whenever he pleased, but now he comes no longer, and this might put out the fire, for I do not believe that it is caught so badly yet, but that water would damp it. But Niccolo mio, you never laid eyes on a lovelier creature. Tall, well-proportioned, rather plump and lean, a white skin, a warm complexion, a face oval or round, I do not know which, but I like it. Seductive, delightful, merry, always laughing, without fluids or ointments on her face, and not very careful of her person. Of her other beauties, I shall say nothing, for I have not tasted them yet, much as I long to. Naturally, I have not escaped scolding, or let us say some friendly admonitions from Filippo and Brancaccio, to which I replied, what seems to me true, that a man should never be rebuked when he knows that he is wrong. This only serves to increase his suffering and not to cure or lessen his error. And it so happens that Filippo is caught in the same toils as those for which he blames me, but in his case it is the errand boy of a goldsmith, who in his opinion is peerless but inviolable, for he is sacred to the host, that is, the goldsmith. Nevertheless, Filippo has been roaming around and feeling his way. Knowing what these Romans are, I tried to restrain him before he went much further, but I failed, and finally the goldsmith threatened to injure him, and would have done so if Filippo had not been frightened away. And now he no longer looks at the boy or even passes through the banchi where his shop is. Whatever stronghold he besieges next will have to be weaker and less well guarded, and hence he's continually consorting with Cersano. So that Brancaccio is disgusted and refuses to walk with him in the streets of Rome, and when I'm at home they're always quarreling, and they appeal to me. They appealed to one of my secretaries as an arbiter, a fellow as big as Piero Ardinghelli, but not very experienced in such things, who has rather been training his hand, which is the first thing required of a writer, than his mind. We live and learn, and many things happen to us in a lifetime. I'm not surprised that Riccia, in her wrath, should have cursed your wisdom, but I should not conclude that she does not love you and will not welcome you whenever you wish, for I should have to think her ungrateful, and I've always found her kind and humane. The wind of love was blowing in all quarters, and Machiavelli began to itch. He made a feeble attempt to draw Vittori back to politics and the problems of the prince, but Vittori made no mention of the prince, and in a brief and despairing review of the situation in Italy, observed with the resignation of a lover of Costantia, "My friend, I know that these kings and princes are men like ourselves, and I know that we do many things, even those which are of very great importance to us, by chance. And so I believe they do too." Chance! If that were true, of what use were reason, theory, thought? Men reasoned, life went its way. He had written a book. If it made so little impression on Vettori, who appreciated him, what would it mean to those who ignored him? Was it not better to drift? There was a lethal release, an irresponsible bliss, an abdicating will and effort, and surrendering to the irresistible force of life. Love at least brought a few hours of relief. "Follow your love with all your might," he replied to Vettori. "The pleasure you have today you will not have tomorrow, and if the affair stands as you say, I envy you more than I do the King of England. Follow your star, I implore you, and do not lose one iota of your pleasure for anything in the world, for I believe, as I always have, and as I always will believe, that what Boccaccio says is true. Better to do and regret it than to regret not having done it." His only regret was that he could not take his own advice, and sooner than be a spoil sport, he became a hermit. For a few weeks there was silence, then he could bear it no longer. There was an involuntary murmur, despondent and submerged. Here I am among my vermin. I find no man who remembers my servitude or believes that I can be good for anything. It is impossible to continue like this much longer. I'm wearing out. I see that if God does not relent, I shall be forced to leave my house and find work as a constable's clerk. If I could do nothing else, or bury myself in some forsaken hole and teach children to read, leave my friends here who already think me dead, and they will be better off without me, for I'm an expense to them now, being unwilling to spend and unable to see them without spending. I do not write this because I wish you to take the least trouble or thought on my account, but merely to relieve myself, and so as never to mention the matter again, since it is as odious as it well can be. And he returned to his vow of silence. The days passed, monastic, stagnant, mute. Nothing happened. Chance itself ignored him. Then a month later he broke his vow. He was a hermit no longer. He was relieved. He found himself a widow. "You, my friend, with your Roman love," he wrote gratefully to Vettori, "have kept up my spirit, and I have eased my mind of infinite vexation, reading and thinking of your pleasures and pains, for they are inseparable. But now fortune has brought me to a point where I can make fitting return. For here in the country I have found a creature so kind, so delicate, so noble, that I cannot praise nor love her enough. Following your example, I should describe the birth of this love, telling you in what toils she took me, where he laid them, and how strong they were. You would see that they were toils of gold, laid amid flowers, woven by Venus, and so gentle and soft that, though a churlish heart could have broken them, I had no heart too. And though I have dallied but a little while, the tender bonds have become hard and have tightened into unbreakable knots. And do not believe that love caught me by his usual snares. I knew them, and they would not have sufficed. He used lures extraordinary, against which I neither could nor would defend myself. Suffice it to say that at an age close to 50, the August sun does not scorch me, these rough roads do not tire me, and the black of night does not frighten me. Everything seems easy, and to every appetite, however contrary to what mine should be now, I adapt myself. And though I seem to have entered into a great commotion, yet in the heart of it I find such ease, both because of this rare and smooth phase of fortune, and because I have forgotten all my cares, that for nothing in the world would I free myself if I could. I have forsaken all thought of great and serious things. I find no pleasure now in reading of ancient or reasoning of modern life. Everything is transformed into sweet themes for which I thank Venus and all Cyprus. So that, if you care to write about your lady, write, and as for other matters, you may discuss them with those who value and understand them more than I do, for I have found nothing but bitterness in them, and in this pleasure and profit. It was his farewell to the prince. A long silence ensued from August to December, and Vettori began to feel lonely again. His infatuation was waning, and his conscience troubled him more than ever. He had perhaps neglected his friend. "You may say that you have had a great many words from me without result," he wrote uneasily. "For this, my excuse is easy. As I have not been able to help myself, you cannot be surprised that I have not helped you. And I am sure that you understand that it was through no lack of goodwill. What worried him most was that Machiavelli no longer talked of love. What was love if not something to talk and, above all, to complain of? Vettori tactfully avoided the subject and tried to wean his crony back to serious things. He sympathized with him assiduously, he thought of him incessantly, he bore his misfortune bravely, and he read him a philosophical lesson. Believe me, we are led by fate. I was reading the other day a book by Pontano on fortune, which has just appeared and which is dedicated to Gonsalvo de Cordova. He proves clearly that neither genius nor foresight nor fortitude nor any other virtue is of any avail against fortune. Rome offers us daily examples of this. Here we find men without breeding, education, or talent in the highest positions. We must acquiesce, and you in particular should do so. For you have known afflictions and have passed through worse ones than this. God will bring this one too to an end. I am sufficiently in favor with the Pope and the other Medici, I believe, but then I ask nothing of them. I spend the salary which the law allows me, and at the end of the month, nothing is left of it. I am free of love, and I have returned gratefully to my books and my card games." Machiavelli acquiesced. He thanked his friend for all the thoughts and efforts you have bestowed on me. I can promise you no reward for them, because I do not believe I shall ever be able to benefit either myself or others, but what must be, must be. He was as stoical as Vettori, and he too shelved the prince. If Vettori could read and forget it in favor of the gospel of fortune, well, he could write and forget it quite as philosophically in favor of the gospel of fortune. But Vettori, now that he was free of love, was plagued by the thought of it. He viewed his friend's growing bondage with deepening sympathy and concern. Unable to inveigle him into serious subjects, he wished at least to make him take a serious view of love. He turned and turned about the subject, unable to find an opening. At last he tapped lightly. Truly, Ovid is right in saying that love is bred of idleness. He began, but there was no response. This idea obsessed him, and after ruminating it for a fortnight, he returned to it. My dear friend, he wrote, there are no letters which I read with more pleasure than yours, and I wish I might write you many things which I know cannot be committed to correspondence. For several months, I have understood only too well how you loved, and I was tempted to say to you, ah, Corydon, Corydon, que te dementia capit. Ah, Corydon, Corydon, what madness has mastered you. Then, reflecting that this world is nothing but love, or to put it more bluntly, liver, I forbore. And I've been thinking how far men are at heart from what they say. A man has a son and says that he means to bring him up decently, yet the first thing he does is to give him a tutor, who spends the whole day with him and has every facility for doing what he likes with him and lets him read things which would put life into the dead. His mother washes and dresses him well to make him more attractive. When he begins to grow, he's given a room on the ground floor where he has a hearth and every other convenience so that he can live freely and bring home whatever company he pleases. We all do this, and those of us who seem to be the most strict are most at fault. It is no wonder, therefore, that our youths are as lewd as they are. It all comes of their wretched upbringing. You and I, old as we are, still keep some trace of the habits we contracted in youth, and there's no help for it. And to steady his friend and win his confidence, he associated himself with his weakness. I wrote you that idleness made a lover of me, and I repeat it, for I have almost nothing to do. I cannot read much because age has weakened my eyesight. I must be accompanied when I go walking, and that is not always possible. If I occupy myself with my thoughts, they bring me for the most part nothing but melancholy, which I shun, and so of necessity I think of pleasant things, and I know nothing more pleasant to do or to think of than fornication. Men may philosophize as they please, but that is the plain truth, which many know, but few will admit. But the silence in San Cassiano was unbroken. It was the silence of consent. With reason baffled, effort defeated, and friendship itself uncomprehending, the prophet subsided and let thought languish into the sensual soliloquy of instinct. What else was left? For after all, Vettori was right. Men may philosophize as they please. And the prince was forgotten. That's enough for today.
Were you reading for an hour?
Oh, there are only 3 pages left. Let's finish this chapter. But his thought was his life. It might languish, it could not die. Machiavelli might quarrel with his genius, neglect and repudiate it. He could not kill it. He was its creature. Even in exhaustion, it needed little to revive it, a mere hint of interest and encouragement, and Vettori now made a contrite attempt to lure him back to politics, and, putting to him certain crucial problems of papal policy, carried his replies to court. Italy was languishing deliciously in a lull toward chronic disturbances, but the war clouds lay low on the horizon. The storm center was Milan, which the French were bent on retaking. The Spanish and the Imperialists were bolstering up their weak and inexperienced puppet, Maximilian Sforza, and Leo, committed to maintaining the status quo, was temporizing, preserving overt neutrality and intriguing covertly with all sides. Machiavelli immediately put his finger on the fallacy of this traditional Italian policy. Effacing himself and letting his ideas speak for him, he fed Vettori the doctrines of the prince and their application to the national problem. It was, he said, the gravest which had arisen in the past 20 years, and I know none more difficult to analyze, more dubious to judge, and so dangerous to decide and to act upon. But the greatest of all dangers was to shirk it. I think that neutrality has never been useful to anyone who finds himself in a position in which he is weaker than any of the combatants, with his states interspersed among theirs, and you must understand first that nothing is more necessary for a prince than so to conduct himself with his subjects, his friends, and his neighbors, that he will be neither hated nor despised, but if he must choose, let him choose to be hated rather than despised. Pope Julius did not care if he was hated as long as he was feared and respected. And by the fear he inspired, he upset the whole world and raised the church to its present position. I tell you that to be neutral means to be hated by the loser and despised by the winner, and when once a man begins to forfeit respect and to be thought a useless friend and a negligible enemy, it is to be feared that every insult and injury will be done to him. If we consider all the states of His Holiness, where they lie, what minor powers they include in the combatants, we must conclude that His Holiness is one of those princes who, under no circumstances, can afford his neutrality. And after weighing all the probabilities and supporting his argument with a meticulous analysis of the contingencies throughout Europe, he concluded that inasmuch as there are more odds of victory on the French side than on the other, and as the Pope by his adhesion can assure the French victory but not that of the others, it would be less formidable and more tolerable to have France as a victor and a friend, and it is impossible to remain safely neutral. I think His Holiness should either adhere to France or else to the others, provided the Venetians joined them, but not otherwise. These letters made an impression. Both your letters and the questions I put to you have been seen by the Pope and Cardinals Bibbiena and Medici, Vittorio reported, and they were all astonished by the talent and praised the judgment they showed. And though we can draw nothing but words from them because of our bad fortune and because I am a man who cannot help his friends, nevertheless, to win the good opinion of the great may someday be of use to you. This little puff sufficed to rekindle Machiavelli's spirit, and it was fanned a few weeks later by a report that the Pope was about to form the long-predicted state for his brother Giuliano. This state, it was rumored, was to comprise Parma, Piacenza, and the Milanese, and Modena and Reggio in Emilia, a composite principality which would form an Italian bulwark on the Lombard front and might become, with Florence and Rome, a nucleus for national federation. Immediately he wrote to Vettori, and in a tone which showed how quickly he recuperated and how deeply in the curative springs of instinct he had already recovered his courage and resiliency. Once more his spirits bubbled, and in reply to Vettori's epistle on the liver, he enclosed a facetious sonnet as proof of his practical philosophy. Anyone who saw our letters in their diversity, my revered crony, he smiled, would be very much surprised, for at one moment we would seem grave men, utterly wrapped in great things, and not a thought in our heads that was not lofty and proper. But then turning the page, he would think us frivolous, fickle, lewd, and utterly wrapped in vanities. And this manner of acting, if to some it seems shameful, to me seems laudable, for we imitate nature which is various, and he that imitates nature cannot be rebuked. And though we usually indulge this variety in several letters, I wish to display it today in one, as you will see if you turn the page. Now, sir, spit and listen. Your brother Pagolo has been here with the Magnifico Giuliano, and in talking to me of his hopes, he mentioned that his lordship has promised to make him governor of one of the states which are to be conferred on him. And as I have heard, not from Pagolo, but from common report, that the Magnifico is to become lord of Parma, Piacenza, Modena, and Reggio, this seems to me a fine and powerful principality, and one which can surely be held if it is governed properly at the beginning. But to govern it properly, one must understand the nature of the subjects. These new states, occupied by a new prince, present infinite difficulties in the holding of them. And if there are difficulties in holding states which are homogeneous, such as the Duchy of Ferrara, how much more difficult is it to hold those which are composed of various fragments, like this one of Signor Giuliano? One part of it is a member of Milan, the other of Ferrara. The first thing that the new prince must do, therefore, is to unite his subjects by residing there in person or by appointing a deputy with supreme authority. And should his lordship still wish to reside in Rome, if he will delegate one who is thoroughly familiar with the nature of the place and local conditions, he will lay an excellent foundation for this new state of his. Duke Valentino, whose work I should always imitate if I were a new prince, knowing this necessity, made Messer Ramiro president of Romagna, a decision which made his people united, fearful of his authority, affectionate to his rule, and confident in it, and all the love which they bore him, which was great considering his newness, sprang from this policy. I believe this could be easily proved because it is true, and if Pagolo was appointed, it would be a position which would win him recognition not only from the Signor Magnifico, but from all Italy, and besides profit and honor to his lordship, he could also bring reputation to himself, to you, and to your house. I have broached these ideas to him. He was pleased and thinks he may use them. I thought I would write you so that you might know our ideas and, if need be, smooth the way for them. He had learned the flexibility of nature. He presented his ideas to Vittori. Unpacking the contents of the prince, stripping its ideas, disclaiming his pride and his parentage, he smuggled them to Rome, offering them to whoever would appropriate and provide for them, and scattered them like pollen on the wind to fertilize the destiny of the Medici. It was a final attempt to outwit misfortune and his friends, and to reach, in an anonymous form, the ear of the Magnifico Giuliano. But Giuliano was not the Medici of the future. Gentle, easygoing, and pleasure-loving, and too liberal for the stern responsibilities of government, he had retired to Rome, where he found a brilliant social life for which he had every aptitude. And there his ear was caught by the voice not of the prince, but of the courtier.
Thank you, sir.
This is a wonderful book by a fellow named Ralph Roeder. It's a critical history of the Italian Renaissance by the examples of Machiavelli, Castiglione, Savonarola, and Aretino. And it's kind of imaginative biographies of all.
Is that, were you reading for an hour and 17 minutes there?
Yep.
Yep, I guess it was. Yep.
Yep.
It's remarkably good prose. This guy writes well.
Is it an old book or?
1920s,
That's
1920s.